It's Wednesday, June the 2nd. Sorry about no fishing report last week. I had family in town, but pretty much fished every day, and a lot going on as far as the lake levels up to 921, which is about 5 feet above normal, and water temperatures actually came down quite a bit. It's been pretty cold rain that we've had. Water temperatures in the high 50s. Before all this rain, it was in the 70s. So, they got floodgates open, a lot of current going on in the lake. But as far as the bite, there's a lot of different ways to catch fish. Still a good way to catch fish is get on a lot of the gravel flats throughout the lake. Swim bait, like a 3.2, anywhere from a 3 to a 4 inch swim bait seems to be working pretty good. And I'm throwing it on a 1/4 ounce and a 3/8 ounce big bite head. The big bite head's a pretty slick little head. It's got two little wire deals in there. You can see them right there. Really lock the bait on, keep them in place real good. You get a lot more out of your swim bait that way. But in a lot of them areas, they're just outside the bushes. A lot of the fish are anywhere from 5 feet deep up to as deep as 20 foot. In a lot of them same areas, you can still catch them on a Ned rig. Catch them on a green pumpkin tube, a puke tube. Watermelon red will work. And I've been catching, a lot more bottom fish than I had been. And even on the swim bait, most of the time the better bite seems to be on the bottom. And, it's not a real aggressive bite. It's still a pretty light bite. I had a guy with me fishing the other day, and he was throwing it on a bait caster and having trouble, feeling the bite. And I swapped him over to a spinning rod with 8-pound line, and he started catching the heck out of them then. So I think a lot of times it makes a difference using that lighter rod and lighter line. But, out there on that gravel, I've been catching them on like a ultimate shaky head 5-fish lures. It's got a 6/0 hook, and I've been using like a Zoom Magnum finesse worm, or even the bigger one, a Magnum trick worm. Been catching some on a football jig, anywhere from a 1/2 ounce to a 3/4 ounce. Catching some on a swing head too. This one's got a biffle bug on it. I'm throwing it in the same places around a lot of that gravel. Like I said, I think you can catch them on a Carolina rig, a split shot. Also catch some on a 5-fish lures, 3/4 ounce ultimate cover jig. Now a lot of the fish, kind of scattered, but when you do find them, you find them pretty bunched up. A lot of my topwater bite, I hadn't been down lake in that clear water. Pretty much the last week and a half, I've been fishing stained off colored water. But the last time I was down lake throwing that surge shad and some different topwater baits, I had a lot of fish slapping at the baits, but I didn't get very many that hooked up with it, and it was a perfect day for it. Now, I've been catching them in that stained water, but I've been using this Spro. It's a Fat Daddy popper, and also a Strike King Sexy Dog. I think them walking baits that are thrashing around, making a lot more noise, are working a little better for me in that stained water than like a jointed redfin or a surge shad. But, we've really got onto some fish on a crankbait, and that's mainly what I was going to talk about today, was the rig I use for the crankbait and the different crankbaits. But normally, the crankbait is a big deal up in the river arms this time of year after the fish spawn. But right now we have got so much color throughout the lake, because they've got the floodgates open, so a lot of the dirty water and the mud that's been coming in the rivers is getting spread out throughout the lake. And I'm actually finding the water's cleaner in the upper river arms than it is in the mid-lake. And then especially with the current, it's just a really good time to throw a crankbait. Normally our fish start going real deep, but with the water temperature like it is and the amount of current that we got in the lake, I don't think we're going to see a thermocline until, late this summer. So a lot of them fish are kind of in crankbait range. And, a lot of times they'll really relate to the current. They won't be right in it, but they'll be like on current break points, on the back side of points, and they'll stack up in there pretty good. We had several places the past few days where when we'd get them fired up on a crankbait, we would just spot lock down and you could catch consecutive fish, cast after cast. Now, I hadn't been catching any real big ones, 3.5, 4 pounds, but you're catching a lot of keepers. And the crankbaits I've been using has been a Strike King 5XD and a 6XD. And I've been throwing a lot of shad colors like a chartreuse sexy shad. This is a regular sexy shad. Chartreuse sexy shad is like what I got on this rod right here. Perch color, but it doesn't have to be a Strike King 5X or 6X. Any crankbait, Rapala makes a lot of good ones like the DT10, the DT16. Sixth Sense makes a good. Here's a Sixth Sense makes a good crankbait. Fat-free shads. It's kind of whatever your favorite crankbait is, but I'm wanting one that gets down about 12 to 14 feet. And usually on my crankbait rods, I'll throw 10 to 12 pound line. I use Sun FC Sniper. I like to use a fluorocarbon on my crankbaits, and I like to throw it on a real long rod. Now, I don't claim to be any kind of a crankbait expert, but over the years I've fished with a lot of people that are, and I picked up a lot of different things from them. Now, as far as the rod length, that's a lot of times it's a personal preference. On my big crankbaits, I'm throwing it on a loose 7-11, almost an 8-foot rod. I like the long rod. I can get longer casts. I can really get that crankbait out there a long ways. The longer the cast you get, the deeper you're going to get the bait, plus it's going to stay down in the strike zone a little bit longer. Now, you can throw them on a 7.3. A lot of times the 5X, I'll throw it on a 7-foot rod. But the one thing I have found with all the people that I know do a lot of crankbaiting, whether you use a fiberglass rod or a graphite, you want a real soft rod with a moderate action. And the reason being, it's not like a worm or a jig where you set the hook, you got to drive the hook into the fish's mouth. The crankbait, usually all you want to do is just give it a little sweep and crank it a little bit faster. So you usually want, a pretty soft rod that also allows you to, make a longer cast with the bait. In talking about the rod, a lot of the reason we use a real soft rod, regardless of what brand of crankbait you're throwing, I really feel that it's important. You have to be able to feel what that bait's doing. You got to know whether your bait's on bottom, whether it's bouncing off rocks or it's, hitting brush or trees. And a lot of times with a stiff rod, you can't feel that. Now, the lighter line, the fluorocarbon, will help you feel a lot of that. Mainly it's in the rod. A lot of the times I used to think a crankbait was like an idiot bait. All you had to do was cast it out there, crank it back in, fish will catch themselves. The more I fished it over the years, the more I found that not to be true. Like I just said a minute ago, you got to be able to feel what the bait's doing. You need to know when it's hitting the structure. A lot of times the bites are going to be when you don't feel that crankbait wobbling anymore. Whether you're throwing a square bill or a deep diving bill, you need to be able to feel that bait wobbling side to side and exactly what that bait's doing. And a lot of times I'm not doing a steady retrieve. I'll crank it real fast at first to get the bait down, and then I'll do a steady retrieve, but I'll pause it, start my retrieve back up. I may crank it real fast, pause it for a second, then change my retrieve, do it a little bit slower. Kind of got to experiment with it, get a couple bites, let the fish tell you, how they want the bait, retrieved. Like I say, the rod to me is the most important, is one of the most important things on crankbait. Now, as far as the speed ratio on my reels, a lot of guys will use, a 5 something for the crankbait. I usually stay with a 6.4 or a 6.8, and if I want a slow retrieve, I just try to discipline myself to crank it a little bit slower. That way I don't have to have a specific reel just for crankbaiting. But if I decide to do something else with that rod and reel, I don't have a slow gear ratio reel on it. But, I will crank sometimes with a 7.5 to 1, but most of the time I try to use like a 6.4 or 6.8 on my retrieve. Now, a lot of the fish I'm catching on a crankbait, like I said, they're not right in the current, but they're back behind it. A lot of them are on bluff ends, gravel flats. A lot of these gravel flats that I was talking about on the main lake where we're catching fish on a swim bait and football jig, I've been able to catch them on a crankbait there too. Anytime the fish are relating to bottom and I feel like I can get down there with the crankbait, you know, the jig or the wobble head is a good bait to throw after they stop biting the crankbait. Or vice versa, if you've been catching them on a jig, crankbait's a good bait. You can catch a few more fish, you know, a little bit different look for the fish, you know, with that crankbait coming by. And a lot of the places I'm catching crankbait fish, I am seeing a lot of bait fish. A lot of times the bait seems to be suspended in that 8 to 10 foot range, but the fish seem to be relating pretty much to the bottom, especially if I'm out there in that current. They're almost, you know, behind a rock, behind some stumps, or someplace where the current is coming over the top of them. And that's where, like my Panoptic, my Garmin Live Scope, I can see the structure down there. I can see a bigger rock or a bigger stump, you know, and try to get the bait in behind that. You just have to kind of visualize which way the water's going, which way the flow's going, so you know how to position your boat and make your cast. But, you know, I think with what's going on, we've got more rain coming. You know, there is fish out there deep. You know, I'm not saying all the fish are in that 20 foot or less range. I was out there messing around the other day and was really struggling, so I backed out to 25, 30 feet and actually caught some, you know, several drop shot fish out there. So there are a lot of Kentuckies moved out there, but I think the majority of the fish without a thermocline are going to stay in that 25 foot or less until the water starts getting real hot and the current slows down. And like I say, with the colored water throughout the lake, a guy doesn't have to go in the river arms. The crankbait's working throughout the lake. And, you know, something I didn't mention is 5 foot of water in the bushes. I don't seem to be getting a real good bite flipping the bushes. There's so much cover in the water. But I'm finding if I get up behind the bushes, especially if I've got an area that's got some grass or, you know, some fields, I catch some on a buzzbait early, catching some on a spinnerbait, and even swimming a white jig back in there behind the bushes instead of a spinnerbait, especially where there's a lot of trash. Another thing to throw back there is a frog. You know, when we get a lot of debris in the water, we call it sawdust like we got, a frog is a good bait to throw. Now, you know, there is a lot of trash in the lake, especially up in the river arms, but I haven't found it too bad. You just got to be careful when you're running. Some days especially when there's no wind, it'll be kind of lingering around all out in the middle, but normally if there's wind, it'll be pushed up to one side or the other. Just keep your life jacket on, kill switch, and you know, be careful out there because there is a lot of floating debris. So till next week, good luck, good fishing.